Most people misunderstand empaths because they confuse kindness with unlimited capacity. They see someone who forgives quickly, someone who listens deeply, someone who repeatedly tries to understand people even when those people are difficult to understand. And because of that, a dangerous assumption begins to form. People start believing that the empath can absorb endless disappointment without changing. They assume patience has no expiration date. But human psychology doesn't work that way. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that because someone remains calm, they are unaffected. Because someone stays present, they assume nothing is accumulating beneath the surface. But empaths often process experiences differently than most people. They don't simply hear words, they absorb emotional context. They pay attention to subtle shifts in energy, tone, patterns of behavior, inconsistencies between actions and intentions. They are watching things most people overlook. And because of that, they often spend a long time trying to explain away what they feel. They tell themselves, maybe they're stressed. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe I should be more understanding. And what looks from the outside like endless tolerance is actually something more complex. It's a continuous internal negotiation. The empath is trying to preserve connection. They're trying to give people room to be imperfect because they understand something important. Everyone carries unseen battles. That understanding is both their strength and their vulnerability. Because when you naturally see pain in others, you become capable of excusing behavior that should probably be confronted earlier. You begin separating the person from the action so effectively that you sometimes tolerate patterns that are slowly damaging you. Not because you're weak, not because you're naive, but because you believe understanding can create change. And sometimes it can, but repeated behavior creates a different psychological reality. The human brain is built around patterns. We survive by recognizing them. If I touch a hot surface once, that's information. If I touch it repeatedly, my brain begins creating certainty. Human relationships work in a similar way. One disappointment can be forgiven. One moment of neglect can be rationalized. One careless comment can be explained away. But repeated patterns become predictions. Eventually, the empath stops responding only to individual moments and starts responding to the structure underneath them. They begin asking different questions. Not what happened today, but what keeps happening. Not why did they do this, but who are they consistently becoming? That's where things start changing. Because the empath isn't reaching a breaking point from one event. They're reaching a breaking point from accumulated evidence. Tiny moments most people consider insignificant begin stacking on top of each other. Broken promises, emotional absence, feeling unheard, feeling valued only when convenient, being expected to give endlessly without receiving the same care in return. Each event alone seems small, but mountains are built from small things. The fascinating part is that this process often remains invisible to everyone around them. The empath still smiles. They still show up. They still help. They still listen. On the outside, everything appears normal, but internally an assessment is taking place. And once that internal assessment begins, something subtle happens. The effort starts changing, because people don't leave when they're angry. Anger still carries energy. Anger still carries hope. People leave when they become emotionally exhausted. They leave when they realize they've been carrying the entire emotional weight of a connection by themselves. And by the time others notice the distance, the process started long before anyone saw it. Because every patient heart has a limit, and every silent accumulation eventually becomes a decision. And once that process begins, something else starts happening beneath the surface that most people never notice. The issue is no longer disappointment itself. It becomes safety. Because relationships are not built on attraction, chemistry, intensity, or even shared experiences alone. Those things can create connection, but they do not sustain it. What sustains connection is emotional safety. Most people hear the phrase emotional safety and imagine comfort, warmth, or kindness. But psychologically, safety is something much deeper. Safety is prediction. Safety is knowing that when you reveal something real about yourself, it won't be used against you later. Safety is believing that your vulnerability will be respected rather than exploited. Safety is consistency between what someone says and what they repeatedly do. Empaths place extraordinary value on this because of the way they experience people. They don't just connect through conversation, they connect through emotional transparency. They are constantly reading emotional signals, processing emotional meaning, and trying to understand what exists beneath behavior. So when they trust someone, they are not offering a superficial transaction. They are opening internal doors that most people never even see. And that's why betrayal affects them differently. People often imagine betrayal as something dramatic. They think of lies, infidelity, deception, or obvious acts of disloyalty. But betrayal frequently enters quietly. Sometimes it arrives through repeated dismissals. Sometimes it arrives through ridicule disguised as humor. Sometimes it appears when someone takes private fears, insecurities, or vulnerable moments and turns them into tools of control. Because betrayal at its core is not simply being hurt. It's realizing that the place where you felt safe no longer feels safe. And once the brain recognizes that, it starts adapting. Human beings naturally move toward environments that create security and away from environments that create threat. What's interesting is that emotional threats are often processed by the mind in ways that resemble physical danger. The body begins anticipating pain before it arrives. The nervous system starts preparing for impact. People become cautious without even realizing why. This is where attachment patterns become important. When someone repeatedly creates instability, the empath often responds by trying harder at first. That surprises people. Most assume hurt creates immediate distance. But many empaths move in the opposite direction initially. They seek understanding. They ask more questions. They increase emotional effort because they believe connection can still be repaired. They think, maybe I need to communicate better. Maybe I need to be more patient. Maybe I just need to understand this person more deeply. But eventually a painful realization starts appearing. You cannot build safety alone. One person cannot maintain trust while the other repeatedly damages it. One person cannot create stability while the other creates uncertainty. Relationships stop becoming relationships at that point. They become emotional survival exercises. And this is where people often make a critical mistake with empaths. They assume forgiveness means the damage disappeared. It didn't. Empaths may forgive behavior long before they trust it again. Those are two entirely different processes. Forgiveness may release anger, but trust is built through evidence. Trust watches actions. Trust studies patterns. Trust waits. Because trust is not restored through explanations. It is restored through consistency. And when emotional safety begins disappearing, something invisible begins disappearing with it: openness. The empath starts sharing less. They explain less. They reveal less. They stop reaching into deeper parts of themselves because something inside them has learned that openness now carries risk. Most people think they lost an empath when the person walked away. No, they started losing them the moment vulnerability stopped feeling safe. Because the fastest way to lose a deeply connected person is to make honesty feel dangerous. And once honesty begins to feel dangerous, a shift starts taking place that many people completely misread. Because most people have been conditioned to recognize emotional pain through visible signals. They expect raised voices, arguments, dramatic confrontations, or emotional outbursts. They expect pain to announce itself. They expect distance to arrive with warning signs. But with empaths, something very different often happens. The volume goes down, and that's where people become confused. Because silence has a strange psychological effect on us. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. We can process conflict. We can process anger. We can process someone telling us exactly what is wrong. But silence creates an empty space, and the mind instinctively rushes to fill empty spaces with assumptions. People often interpret an empath's silence as weakness. They assume the person has surrendered. They assume they are confused, hurt, or temporarily withdrawing before things return to normal. But many times that interpretation is completely wrong. Because silence is not always an absence of action. Sometimes silence is action. Think about what has already been happening beneath the surface. The empath has been observing patterns for a long time. They've been explaining behavior away. They've been extending understanding, protecting connection, and trying to repair emotional fractures before they become emotional collapses. They've been carrying questions inside their own mind while hoping circumstances improve. And eventually a moment arrives where something internal changes. Not externally, internally. Because there comes a point where the mind stops asking, how do I fix this? And starts asking, why am I carrying this alone? That question changes everything. Because effort has a psychological cost. Emotional investment has a psychological cost. People often imagine exhaustion as something physical, but emotional exhaustion can be even more powerful because you cannot always see it happening. It accumulates silently. It builds through repeated emotional labor, repeated disappointment, repeated attempts to hold together something that feels increasingly unstable, and eventually the nervous system begins protecting itself. What's fascinating is that protection does not always look aggressive. Protection sometimes looks quiet. The empath starts reducing emotional output. Conversations become shorter. Reactions become smaller. Things that once created long discussions now receive brief responses. The person who once tried to explain every feeling suddenly stops explaining. People around them usually think, good, things are calmer now. But calm and disconnected are not the same thing. Sometimes the room becomes quiet because peace has arrived. Sometimes the room becomes quiet because someone has emotionally left. And that distinction matters. Because anger still contains attachment. Think about that for a moment. Anger requires energy. It requires investment. You do not fight intensely for something you no longer care about. Arguments, frustration, emotional reactions. These things often reveal that someone is still trying to save the connection. Silence can mean something entirely different. Silence can mean the internal debate has ended. And this is why people often say things like, they changed overnight. They suddenly became cold. I don't understand what happened. But psychological shifts rarely happen overnight. We only notice them overnight because we were paying attention to visible behavior instead of invisible accumulation. The withdrawal began long before the silence arrived. The silence was simply the first thing everyone else noticed. Because when an empath reaches this point, they are no longer seeking answers from the other person. They are seeking clarity within themselves. And once people stop fighting to be understood, something profound has already changed. Because the most dangerous silence is not the silence of anger. It's the silence that arrives when the heart decides it has nothing left to prove. And when the heart reaches the point where it feels it has nothing left to prove, the final stage often begins. This is the moment people misunderstand more than any other. Because from the outside, it can look sudden. It can look cold. It can even look calculated. Someone wakes up one day and realizes the empath is gone. The calls are shorter. The messages are gone. The emotional availability that once seemed endless has disappeared. And people ask the same question over and over, what happened? The strange thing is, from the empath's perspective, that question may feel almost impossible to answer, not because there was no reason, but because there were too many reasons, too many small moments, too many dismissed feelings. Too many times they attempted to communicate what was happening while hoping the other person would finally understand. People tend to search for one dramatic cause because the mind likes simple explanations. We prefer singular events. We want a moment we can point to and say, that's where everything changed. But relationships rarely collapse from a single event. Structures don't fail because of one crack. They fail because tiny fractures were ignored while pressure continued to build. And by this point, the empath has already gone through a process most people never witnessed. They've replayed conversations in their mind. They've questioned themselves repeatedly. They've examined their own behavior and asked difficult questions. Am I expecting too much? Am I being unfair? Am I misunderstanding this person? Because empaths tend to turn the investigation inward before turning it outward. They assume responsibility long before assigning blame. They look for ways to improve situations before deciding to leave them. And that process can take an enormous amount of time, months sometimes, years sometimes. That's why people become confused when the ending finally arrives. They think they are witnessing a decision being made in real time. They're not. They're witnessing the visible outcome of a decision that has been forming internally for a very long time. Because psychologically, human beings separate long before they physically leave. The body may still be present. The conversations may still happen. The routines may still exist. But internally, distance has already started developing. Think of it like watching a tree during autumn. Most people notice the leaves once they hit the ground. They say the tree changed. No, the process started long before that. Changes were happening inside the structure before anyone could see evidence of them. Human connection works the same way. And when an empath reaches this final point, something important happens. The energy that was once invested outward starts turning inward. Instead of trying to save everyone else, they begin saving themselves. Instead of asking, how do I keep this connection alive? They start asking, what happens if I finally give myself the same care I've been giving away? That's not revenge. That's not punishment. That's not emotional manipulation. That's self-preservation. Because eventually people realize something profound. Constantly abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable is still a form of abandonment. And once an empath understands that, the internal door starts closing, not with anger, not with noise, not with dramatic final speeches, just quietly. Because when people think an empath disappeared overnight, they usually misunderstand what they are seeing. The empath didn't suddenly leave. They simply stopped returning to a place they had already been leaving for a very long time. Because people rarely lose someone in a moment. They lose them in the patterns they chose to ignore.